The polished leather briefcase hit the armrest with a deliberate thud as Marcus Wellington settled into seat 3A, his Armani suit crisp despite the early morning hour. He barely glanced at the man struggling down the aisle, a tired-looking figure in a wrinkled flannel shirt, juggling a worn backpack and a child's cartoon-covered carry-on. Marcus had perfected the art of not seeing people he deemed beneath his notice. It was a skill that had served him well in the boardroom, though it had cost him 2 marriages and the respect of his own children. But on this ordinary Tuesday morning, 37,000 feet above the ground, Marcus Wellington was about to learn that the universe has a peculiar way of humbling those who've forgotten what truly matters. Jake Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he guided his daughter Emma down the narrow aisle of Flight 447. The 5-year-old clutched her stuffed elephant, Mr. Trunk, while her father searched for their seats, 22C and 22D, tucked in the back near the lavatories. It wasn't ideal, but it's what his budget allowed. Single parenthood on a construction worker's salary meant choosing between comfort and necessity always won. "Daddy, that man looks angry," Emma whispered, nodding toward the first-class section where Marcus sat, his face twisted in annoyance as he typed furiously on his phone. "Some people are just having a bad day, sweetheart," Jake replied, though he'd caught the CEO's disdainful look as they passed. He'd seen that expression before, on the faces of Emma's friends' parents at the private school she'd attended before her mother died, on business owners who assumed he couldn't read a contract, on people who measured worth in dollar signs rather than character. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Marcus noticed Emma's delighted squeal when she spotted clouds through the window. He rolled his eyes and increased the volume on his noise-canceling headphones. He had a presentation to review, a merger to finalize, and zero patience for the chaos of economy-class families invading his space with their sticky-fingered children and their poverty-adjacent problems. The first hour of the flight passed uneventfully. Jake helped Emma with her coloring book, ordered her a ginger ale when the cart came by, and tried not to think about the medical bills waiting at home or the fact that his late wife's parents were threatening custody proceedings, claiming he couldn't provide properly for their granddaughter. The custody hearing was in 3 days, the very reason for this trip to his lawyer in Chicago, using miles he'd been saving for 2 years. Then, everything changed. A sharp voice crackled over the intercom, tight with controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We're experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. My co-pilot has lost consciousness, and I need immediate assistance. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, particularly anyone with military or fighter pilot training, please identify yourself to the flight attendants immediately." The cabin erupted in anxious murmurs. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of the situation, but from the weight of what he knew he had to do. His hand moved to the call button, then hesitated. It had been 8 years since he'd flown an F-18. 8 years since the accident that had ended his Navy career, the training exercise gone wrong, the split-second decision that saved 3 lives but shattered his left leg and his confidence. 8 years since he'd walked away from the cockpit, convinced he'd lost the edge that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "Daddy." Emma's voice was small, frightened. She'd seen him reach for the button. Marcus, despite his earlier detachment, felt genuine fear coil in his stomach. He was a man who controlled every variable, who built empires on calculated risks. But this was chaos incarnate, the ultimate loss of control. He glanced around the first-class cabin, hoping to see someone, anyone, stand up with military bearing and confident competence. Instead, he watched as a flight attendant rushed past, and through the gap in the curtain, he saw the tired, wrinkled shirt-wearing man from economy standing in the aisle, his hand raised. "I have fighter pilot experience," Jake said quietly to the attendant, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. U.S. Navy, 10 years, F-18 Hornets. "I'm qualified on several aircraft types." The attendant's relief was palpable. "Come with me, sir." Quickly. Jake turned to Emma, kneeling to her eye level. "Baby, I need you to be very brave right now. Mr. Trunk is going to stay with you, and this nice lady," he gestured to the elderly woman across the aisle who'd been watching with concern, "is going to sit right here. Daddy has to go help fly the plane. Like you used to." Emma's eyes were wide but not panicked. Jake had told her stories of his Navy days, editing out the danger, focusing on the wonder of touching the sky. "Exactly like I used to." As Jake moved toward the cockpit, Marcus found himself standing, his own fear momentarily forgotten. Wait, that guy. The one who looks like he can barely afford his ticket. He's going to fly this plane. The flight attendant's glare could have melted steel. That man is trying to save your life, sir. I suggest you sit down and let him work. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was pale, sweat beading on his forehead as he managed both controls while his co-pilot lay unconscious, the victim of what appeared to be a stroke. You must be my angel, he said as Jake entered. Please tell me you remember how to do this. Jake's eyes scanned the instrument panel, different from his F-18, but the fundamentals were the same. The language of aviation was universal: airspeed, altitude, heading, attitude. His hands, calloused from construction work, remembered the feel of controls. His mind, dulled by years of ground-based routine, suddenly sparked back to life. I remember, he said, sliding into the co-pilot's seat as the flight attendants carefully moved the unconscious man. Talk me through your specific procedures for this aircraft. For the next 40 minutes, Jake Morrison stopped being a struggling single father and became again what he'd once been: a pilot, a guardian of lives, a man who could look at chaos and see solutions. He communicated with air traffic control, helped Captain Reynolds plot a course to the nearest suitable airport in Des Moines, and talked down a situation that could have ended in catastrophe. His hands never shook. His voice never wavered. In that cockpit, with 237 lives depending on him, Jake found something he'd lost in the wreckage of his Navy career: not just competence, but purpose. When the wheels touched down on the runway, the landing was textbook perfect. The cabin erupted in applause and relieved tears. Marcus Wellington, who'd spent the descent in prayer for the first time since childhood, watched Jake emerge from the cockpit. The crew was thanking him, passengers were reaching out to touch his arm in gratitude, and his little daughter was crying happy tears as she hugged his legs. And Marcus saw, perhaps for the first time in decades, what real wealth looked like. As paramedics boarded to attend to the co-pilot, Marcus approached Jake, his usual arrogance stripped away. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. In my life. Jake studied him, this polished, expensive man who'd looked through him hours earlier. You don't owe me anything. I just did what needed to be done. The mocking look I gave you earlier. I know the look. I've seen it before. Jake's voice held no bitterness, only tired acceptance. Marcus swallowed hard. I'm Marcus Wellington. I run Wellington Industries. What do you do? Construction. Carpentry, mostly. You were Navy. Yes, sir. Until I wasn't. Something in Marcus's chest cracked open, something that had been sealed shut by years of competition and conquest. I'd like to hear that story. And I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Jake hesitated, then glanced at Emma, who was showing Mr. Trunk to the kind elderly woman who'd sat with her. I have a custody hearing in 3 days. My in-laws think I can't provide for my daughter properly. They're not wrong about my bank account, but they're wrong about everything else. Marcus pulled out his phone, and for once, his wealth and influence weren't weapons or shields, they were tools for good. I know the best family attorney in Chicago. She'll take your case pro bono if I ask. And Wellington Industries is always looking for project managers, people with leadership experience, crisis management skills, and unshakable integrity. The pay is considerably better than construction. Jake's eyes glistened. Why would you do that? Because an hour ago, you saved my life without hesitation. And because I've spent 20 years measuring people by the wrong standards. Marcus extended his hand. Let me be clear, this isn't charity. Based on what I saw today, you're exactly the kind of person I should have been hiring all along. 3 months later, Emma Morrison sat in the front row of Wellington Industries' quarterly shareholder meeting, swinging her legs and clutching Mr. Trunk. On stage, her father stood beside Marcus, being introduced as the new director of operations, a position he'd earned through a combination of natural leadership, innovative thinking, and the kind of grace under pressure that can't be taught. The custody case had been dismissed. Jake's in-laws, seeing his transformed circumstances and, more importantly, the unchanged devotion with which he raised their granddaughter, had withdrawn their petition and instead asked to be part of Emma's life in a supportive rather than adversarial role. But the real transformation wasn't in job titles or bank accounts. It was in Marcus Wellington, who'd started a foundation providing career counseling and job placement for veterans transitioning to civilian life. It was in the way he now saw people, really saw them, measuring character rather than credentials, potential rather than polish. "You changed my life," Marcus had told Jake over coffee the week before. Jake had smiled. "No, I just reminded you who you could be. Sometimes the universe doesn't humble us to break us. Sometimes it humbles us to remake us into who we were always meant to become. And sometimes, the person in the wrinkled flannel shirt, struggling down the aisle with cartoon luggage and tired eyes, is exactly the hero the moment requires, and exactly the teacher an arrogant heart needs." The flight that morning had been scheduled to take 3 hours. Instead, it became the journey of a lifetime for two men who learned that true altitude has nothing to do with where you sit on a plane, and everything to do with how high you're willing to rise when others need you most.